Hi, I'm Nick Tyrone, neoliberal centrist dad, and today I'm going to be talking to you about why socialism sucks. People often say socialism doesn't work, and then socialists will respond with, "What do you mean it doesn't work? How can you define whether something works or it doesn't? Isn't that all subjective? Perhaps your neoliberal viewpoint of the world means you define words like works in a different way than we would as Marxists. So instead of saying it doesn't work, like I say, I'm here to argue the case that socialism sucks. Right. I think first of all, we need to define socialism, which probably shouldn't be controversial, but is, because, again, a classic thing that socialists will say that's quite annoying is, well, you don't like socialism because you don't understand what it is. You have no idea what socialism is. And then some of the worst ones will often go off on something like, well, socialism is just people being nice to each other, or some crap like that. To be fair, that's a pretty dumb socialist, but dumb even by socialist standards. But anyway, that you will get that. So let's define socialism. I think there are two acceptable definitions of it. Both of them are very similar and interrelated. So the first one is almost like a pure Marxist definition of socialism. Marx defines socialism essentially as a stage that society has to go through. So you have capitalism that Marx saw actually as valuable in a way and necessary thing for civilization to go through on its journey, basically. But it was cruel and it had horrible elements to it, and Marx didn't like capitalism, but he saw that capitalism, we needed to have capitalism to invent a whole bunch of stuff and get a whole bunch of stuff in place so that we could move on to socialism. And the stage of socialism is a stage before communism. So I have to define communism, which in a Marxist sense, which I'll do. So socialism within Marx it basically means an end to capitalism, right? A total end to capitalism. So the ceasing of private ownership of land and resource, property or business, and essentially a centralized state that seizes all power, and you have all economic and political power, and in order to create a dictatorship of the proletariat. So it would mean the workers control the means of production and distribute the fruits of that labor equally amongst everyone in society. So everyone is equal, and the idea is essentially within socialism is that within sort of a generation or two of socialism being in place, there would be no class distinctions of any kind, which becomes important, and I'll come back to that, because that's what makes communism work. So communism is the bit where the state falls away as no longer relevant. So we don't need the state to control stuff anymore because we've all evolved, basically, and we don't need the state to redistribute anymore because we're just doing it somehow naturally. It's never really... Communism is a little bit utopian in Marxism, and isn't well defined in terms of... It's like heaven, basically. That's the essence. A stateless, classless society where the means of production are owned communally and goods are distributed based on need, not contribution. That's communism. So, in a sense, actually, the states calling themselves communist were not communist at all. They were socialist. A bit of a confusion, but anyhow... I think another definition of socialism that I think is worth talking about is one that comes down through the history of socialism, through Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, their writings, down through 20th century, the actual workings of socialism. And that's just basically where there's no private enterprise and the government owns everything and centrally runs the economy. Again, not that different from Marx's perspective, but I think it can be worth looking at socialism not as a step towards communism, as in this utopian vision, but socialism as an end in of itself. So that's how you define that. Those are, I think, acceptable definitions of socialism. Now let's define what isn't socialism, because I think this is equally important. People now are often saying, particularly on the left, are saying such and such a place is socialism, and that's why socialism works. Actually, people saying that socialism's bad or whatever. What about Denmark? Or what about Sweden? Denmark and Sweden are not socialist countries. I mean, they just simply aren't. They are social democracies. which basically means there is a large welfare state, taxation's very high, but the economy is mainly capitalist, right? So it's mainly private enterprise doing stuff. They're just taxed very heavily so that there can be a lot of public service. So it's not socialist, right? Because it isn't the government taking hold of the means of production and then distributing it. It's not centrally planned. They aren't centrally planning the economy. The economy is still run by the capitalists. Do you see what I'm saying? It's just that it's more heavily taxed, and that is redistributed via public services mainly, and welfare, obviously. But it's important to understand that, I mean, even America could be socialist under this definition of Denmark being socialist. Because, actually, taxes are lower in America than they are in, well, certainly a country like Denmark or Sweden, but they're still, like, reasonably high. It's not like it's a libertarian state where you're paying, like, 5% of your income. It's a lot. When you add in federal income tax, state tax, property tax, all the rest of it, Americans actually pay a lot in tax. And there's a reasonably high level of public services, not to a European level, and obviously you don't have a socialized medical service, but nonetheless you have actually a reasonable amount of public services. So is America a socialist country? That's ridiculous. And Denmark is just, it isn't even that much more socialist than America when it comes right down to it. All right, so now that we've gone through the definitions, let's get to the nitty-gritty. Why does socialism suck? That's because if you take out Denmark and Sweden as not being socialist, which they are not, socialism has been tried and been really awful wherever it has been tried. Really awful. And actually, despite being tried across many different cultures in many different parts of the world, Chinese culture is extraordinarily different than Romanian culture. I think we could all agree on that. And yet, actually, socialism failed in both countries for pretty much very, very, very similar reasons. But I could go on about things like loss of freedom, why if you take away capitalism, blah, blah, blah. I could probably go on some talking points which are right-wing, but what I want to do here is I want to critique socialism from a left-wing perspective. So all the things that the left think are important, I want to look at how socialism handled those things and then criticize socialism through that lens. Okay? So I've picked 3 things in which to criticize socialism through the lens of. One is inequality, basically the idea of socialism helps make everyone equal in society, and it helps redistribute resource so that everyone is equal. So equality is one. Second one is environmentalism, very important to the modern left, the environmental movement. So I'm looking at socialism through that lens. And then the final one will be overall wealth of the nation state, the well-being of people, of the state. How does socialism does it make the country better off? Which, again, the left want to say that that's what socialism will do. It will make us all better off, and it will make us, and those better expanded resources will be more equitably distributed, right? So equality. Socialism didn't produce very equal societies. In fact, the Soviet Union in particular was unbelievably unequal in terms of wealth distribution near the end. And that's particularly weird given how dedicated they were to trying to redistribute wealth. And I think one of the reasons this doesn't work under socialism, it's the left's misunderstanding of hierarchy, right? They think of hierarchy, it's in Marx, you can see it in Marx, this idea that once you get rid of the class structure, there will be no hierarchy. And so once there's no hierarchy, no one will feel the need to be better than anyone else, and therefore we'll just have this classless society that's where everyone just accepts equality. But that never, ever, ever happens, because actually hierarchy is just baked into the human condition. It just is. If you want to have an example of that, work for a left-wing organization, which I have done, in which you are told that there is a flat structure. So there are no bosses. Everybody is equal within this organization. Except, of course, that never ever works, because actually there is always power, right? So Who has access to money? The money in the organization. Who really has the access, because they have the access to the money, to hire and fire people? Right? That person has power, whether you acknowledge it or not. And in fact, when you don't acknowledge their power, it's worse, because at least if they're, okay, they've got the power and they're in charge, right? Then they're responsible, and they can be held responsible if things go bad. Like if someone's mistreated, or there's, God forbid, like sexual harassment or whatever, lays at the boss's door, because they have the power and they have the responsibility. However, in a flat structure, what you have is people who have power but no responsibility. So when things screw up, they can just say, look, hey, we're all equals, brother. You know, I'm not any more in charge than you are. Not my fault. And this leads to so many problems. I could do a half-hour video on this, but I think I've made at least the initial point. Hierarchies instill themselves. When you get rid of one hierarchy, when you blow one away, another one naturally takes its place, because we look for leaders. You can bemoan that and say that's a terrible thing about humanity and you wish humanity wasn't like that. But that is what humanity is like. We look for, we naturally create hierarchies. We just do, and we do it in every situation that's a group dynamic. Always, every time, always. In fact, when that doesn't happen, even amongst a very small group, like 3 or 4 people, like say in a rock band, and even rock bands generally have hierarchies, right? There's a guy who's basically in charge. But sometimes you can get to a point where it's like 3 or 4 people, and they actually do manage to get along and agree. That's really rare and really difficult, and really takes a special group of people, and usually takes them years and years and years to get to that point. It's really, really hard to actually live as equals. We just create hierarchies. That's what we do as human beings. All right, I think I've touched on equality, and I don't want to make this video to be too long. So the second one is environmentalism. And this is actually the real gotcha for socialism, because the socialist countries of the 20th century were some of the most ecologically destructive governments of all time. Socialism's record on the environment is absolutely horrible. So the next time you see a socialist say, look, we just need to get rid of capitalism and have a socialist society, and then, you know, having a green economy will just naturally flow from that. Well, okay. I could point to many environmental disasters. You know, you could point to Chernobyl. You could point to the fact that their handling of all sorts of industrial waste was disgraceful, basically putting it in huge pools of rotten matter that sat there for decades. And in fact, a lot of the old Warsaw Pact countries, when they were free of Soviet rule, it took them a long time to clean that up. But actually, I'm going to point to something much more pointed than that, and actually much more intentional, a real ecological disaster, and that's the Aral Sea, Aralc. It's in Kazakhstan, and I think a part of it used to go into Russia, but what's left of it's in Kazakhstan. And basically what happened to the Aral Sea is a ecological and humanitarian crisis that was caused by, essentially the Soviets wanted to divert the water from the sea to irrigate cotton, fields of cotton. And it was a total disaster. Okay? So it was 68,000 square kilometers at its largest, at its original natural size. This irrigation started in the 1960s. By 2007, the Aral Sea had shrunk by 10%. It shrunk to 10% of its original size, right? So it had lost 90% of its volume and size. Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, once called it one of the planet's worst ever environmental disasters. And you know what? That is absolutely true. And it was intentional. And actually, it's exactly the kind of thing that happens with planned economies. Is you get a bit desperate, you got to keep the thing going, you got to keep the jobs moving, you got to keep people fed, and you come up with things like, well, I guess we could, do this, and you can see that actually it's a disaster, but actually to back out of it would be too difficult, and no one who actually would want it to happen actually has the power to do it, because again, this idea that you have a flat structure but you don't really, there are actual people in charge, and they just want to keep it going, and you end up with a total disaster. So socialism does not equal green at all. Really doesn't. One of the biggest lies of socialism is that it's somehow, in fact, that not only is it green, but that it's the one way to get to a green economy would be through socialism. Totally proven wrong by history over and over and over again. Anyway, finally, one is just the overall wealth of the nation state. It's interesting that the socialist countries were generally poor. They were poorer than their capitalist neighbors. And really, it was because you have less output. And this is a thing that Marx could never understand. He has this idea, which I could do a whole video on this, and maybe I will at some point, but the labor theory of value, which basically says that if you put work in equals value out, basically. And we all know that isn't true. A 7-year-old could come up with arguments against it without thinking very hard, okay? If work equals value, just think about that for a second, right? So what that's saying is, if you get a random guy to write a 50,000 word novella, okay, and he spends 100 hours on it, that will be worth precisely the same, they'll have exactly the same value as if you get Stephen King to write a 50,000 word novella. And we all know instinctively, immediately, that isn't true, right? Because actually there are other aspects to value, loads of them. One of them being ingenuity, one of them being efficiency, one of them being any number of things. Loads of things go into value. The idea that it only actually adds up to what a worker does is nonsense. If I open a factory, okay, let's do it this way. I open 2 factories. One of them creates a product that is utterly worthless that no one wants to buy, okay? The other one produces a product that has an intrinsic value and will always do well, okay? Now, the workers in both factories work just as hard, okay? Let's say they work exactly as hard. Almost like if I could clone the workers from one factory and put them in another. That would be the perfect element to this experiment. Okay, so the workers work exactly as hard in both factories. One produces a valueless product, one produces a valuable product. Okay? Thereby proving, once again, that the labor theory of value is nonsense. And this is so important to socialism because it's the idea that if you have a capitalist society, okay, and it's producing X amount, right? X amount of goods, X amount of GDP per capita, that if you made it into a socialist country and they basically kept producing exactly the same things and kept doing roughly the same things, only this time there were no capitalists hogging the profits, right? It was just being redistributed to the workers, that the output wouldn't change at all. And essentially you would have exactly the same GDP. Except that the socialists proved again and again and again that wasn't the case. And it wasn't the case because actually without the people saying, no, you have to, you're trying to innovate, trying to make the machines that might be used better, trying to make the product better, trying to make the product more likable to what people wanted. Without those innovations, what happens is the GDP, the value in the society starts to go down, 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 down. And actually not because the workers are working less. I mean, they might be. But actually, even if they worked more, and actually in a lot of socialist countries, that's exactly what happened. They started working more hours. They started having to work harder because there was this race to try and get up to the same level of GDP. And the socialist countries could never figure it out because Marx never wrote about that, and it was never really covered in Marx, this idea of like, okay, well, if we're doing the same amount of stuff, why is productivity shrinking so badly? Very obvious, right? Because value isn't created by work. Work is part of value, and in many cases, you could not get the value of something without the work, right? But if I'm a gold digger, right? Like a literal gold digger, so I am like, I've got a pickaxe and I'm trying to get gold, right? I could like try and look for gold for 20 years, slaving my ass off, breaking my back, and get very little gold in return. And some guy could go out and get a chunk of gold this big because he fell over it, right? He's way richer than I am, despite the fact that I worked for 20 years to do it. Again, the idea that work creates value all on its own is a nonsense, and it's one of the reasons why socialism falls apart, and ultimately why socialism sucks. Anyway, on that note, I'll leave it here. I might do more videos about socialism sucking because I quite enjoy talking about it, and quite enjoy, because I just feel like socialist arguments are so bad and so outdated and so proven to be false, essentially, by basic reality. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Nick Tyrone, Neoliberal Centrist Dad. If you watched this far, please like, subscribe to the video. I'd really appreciate it. I'll see you soon. Bye.